Nearly 80% of young adults today confess to feeling lost, alienated, disconnected. But what does it mean to be lost? It doesn't always look like homelessness or despair on the streets. It looks like waking up in the morning and feeling no reason to get out of bed. It looks like scrolling endlessly through feeds, chasing fragments of meaning, but never finding a story that includes you. It looks like surrounding yourself with friends, yet secretly feeling that no one really sees you. This epidemic is not always visible because it hides behind polished profiles, smiling selfies, and curated images. But behind the mask, there is silence. A silence that Jung, more than a century ago, recognized as the forgotten cry of the soul. And so we must ask, how did we reach this point? We live in the most connected age in human history, billions of devices linking billions of people in an instant. The promise was that technology would liberate us from distance, from boredom, even from loneliness. Yet never have so many felt so utterly alone. This paradox is not trivial. It shapes the very fabric of our lives. The student who feels his studies are meaningless, the worker who spends years in a job that feels empty, the young woman who performs an online persona but no longer knows who she is when the screen turns black. Alienation today is not only personal, it is generational, it is civilizational. Marx spoke of alienation in factories, where workers were separated from the fruits of their labor. Kierkegaard warned of despair, the sickness unto death that comes when we refuse to become our true selves. Heidegger described modern life as a forgetting of being itself. And Jung looked into this same abyss and said, "The problem is not only in the world around us, it is in the world within us. We have turned away from the soul." When nearly 4 out of 5 young adults say they feel directionless, we must take this seriously. This is not simply a crisis of economics or politics or technology. It is a spiritual crisis, a crisis of meaning, a crisis of authenticity. And this is where Jung becomes our guide, a physician of the human spirit. He diagnosed this illness long before smartphones, before social media, before globalization, and his message was simple. If you abandon the inner world, the outer world will eventually consume you. So before we move further, I want you to reflect on a question. Do you recognize yourself in this epidemic of disconnection? Do you feel that subtle emptiness, the quiet loneliness, even when surrounded by people? If so, you are not alone. You are simply confronting the same reality Jung devoted his life to understanding. We often tell ourselves that modern life is the most advanced, the most liberated era in history. And on the surface, it is. We have access to more knowledge than all past generations combined. We can speak to someone on the other side of the world in an instant. We can build careers, identities, even relationships through screens. But beneath this glittering promise hides a deep fracture. We are connected, but not to ourselves. We are entertained, but not fulfilled. We are informed, but not wise. The constant pressure of performance saturates every corner of modern existence. We no longer simply work. We are expected to brand ourselves, to sell our labor, our attention, even our personalities. Online, we curate a version of ourselves that is polished, edited, optimized. But this digital mask often bears little resemblance to the fragile human being behind it. Here is the paradox. Never before have humans been so visible, and never before have they felt so invisible. Think of the endless cycle of comparison. Every scroll reveals a life that looks better than yours, someone richer, fitter, more successful, more admired. Social media was meant to connect us, yet it has become a theater of inadequacy, magnifying what Jung would call the persona, the mask we show to society. And like any mask, the longer you wear it, the harder it becomes to remember the face underneath. This is not just an individual problem. It is systemic. A society built on consumption needs us to feel incomplete, to crave endlessly. Advertising whispers, "You are not enough unless you buy this, achieve this, display this." And so the market colonizes even the most intimate corners of the soul. Jung warned of this dynamic more than a century ago. He saw that the modern world, with its obsession for material progress, risked abandoning the inner world entirely. To him, this was not simply unfortunate, it was catastrophic, because when the soul is silenced, its hunger does not disappear, it mutates. It emerges as anxiety, as depression, as rage, as numbness. It expresses itself in addictions, compulsions, in the inability to sit in silence without reaching for distraction. Ask yourself, when was the last time you sat in stillness, without a phone, without music, without a screen, and simply listened to your own thoughts? For many, that experience is unbearable. But why? Because silence reveals the truth of our disconnection. This is the modern epidemic. Not the lack of connection between people, but the loss of connection to ourselves. We mistake stimulation for meaning, distraction for purpose, quantity of communication for quality of relationship. And so modern man stands surrounded by constant signals, yet feels cut off from life. We are like travelers in a crowded station, hearing thousands of voices, but unable to recognize our own. Jung called this the loss of soul, not a religious loss, but the neglect of the inner compass, the voice that tells us who we are and why we are here. And without that compass, we drift. We drift through endless images, endless choices, endless possibilities, but with no direction, no center. The digital age promised us freedom. What it delivered was noise. And in that noise, the soul whispers. But we have forgotten how to listen. Carl Jung was not a social critic in the conventional sense. He was not writing manifestos about economics or politics. He was, first and foremost, a physician of the psyche. Yet what he observed in his patients a century ago has only grown more relevant with time. Jung believed that the modern world, with all its dazzling progress, carried within it a hidden danger, the neglect of the inner life. He wrote that man has become hopelessly externalized, absorbed in what he produces, what he owns, and how he appears, while the inner world, the soul, is left to wither in silence. This, for Jung, was not simply unfortunate, it was a radical diagnosis. Modern man is suffering from a crisis of authenticity. What does this mean? Authenticity, for Jung, was not a lifestyle choice, not a trend or aesthetic. It was the alignment between one's inner reality and one's outer existence. To live authentically meant to live from the center of the self, the totality of the psyche, rather than merely from the persona, the mask constructed to please society. In other words, we have become experts in playing roles while forgetting the actor behind the mask. Think of the pressures shaping our lives today. From a young age, we are told what success looks like. Grades, careers, relationships, possessions. Each milestone is presented as proof of worth. And yet how often do we achieve one of these goals, only to feel emptier than before? This is the paradox of the authenticity crisis. The more we conform to society's image of success, the more distant we become from our own essence. Jung noticed this long before social media. But imagine how much more powerful the dynamic has become in an age where our very identities are commodified. Online, We do not just present ourselves, we market ourselves. We become brands, and like all brands, we risk being consumed by the image we create. The danger here is not only personal. Jung warned that when a society loses contact with the inner life, it begins to project its shadow outward. The unacknowledged fears and desires of individuals accumulate, shaping collective movements, mass hysteria, even violence. History is filled with examples of what happens when alienated individuals seek belonging in destructive ideologies. But at the individual level, the crisis is more subtle and perhaps more tragic. You may appear successful, admired, even envied, yet if the life you live does not resonate with the voice within, you will feel that haunting emptiness, that quiet sense of fraudulence. You will sense, in Jung's words, that you are living someone else's life. This is why Jung rejected the idea that happiness could be pursued directly. For him, the goal was not happiness, but wholeness. Happiness may come and go. Wholeness, by contrast, is the state of being integrated, authentic, aligned with the self, and this cannot be bought, borrowed, or performed. It must be discovered. To Jung, the authenticity crisis was not an abstract philosophical problem. It was the central wound of modern humanity. He believed that unless we turn inward, unless we confront our unconscious and recover the soul, no amount of progress in the outer world will fill the void. And so we must ask ourselves, are we truly living, or are we merely performing? Is the life we display the life we desire, or is it only a mask designed to shield us from the truth of our own emptiness? This is the challenge Jung places before us. It is not easy, and it is not comfortable, but to ignore it is to remain trapped in a life that is polished on the outside, but hollow within. When Jung spoke of the loss of soul, he did not mean something mystical vanishing into thin air. He meant that modern man, by neglecting his inner life, slowly becomes estranged from himself, and this estrangement manifests in symptoms, subtle yet devastating. Look at our age. Rates of anxiety and depression climb year after year, despite greater wealth, comfort, and access to medicine than any generation before us. The paradox is striking. The more we secure external stability, the less stable we feel within. Chronic anxiety, for example, is often treated as a purely medical disorder. But Jung saw in anxiety the soul's alarm bell, a signal that something essential is being ignored. When the conscious life drifts too far from the inner truth, the psyche resists. It demands attention, and when ignored, it screams through symptoms. Depression, too, in Jung's view, was not simply an absence of energy. It was the weight of a life disconnected from meaning. He described it as a descent into the unconscious, a forced retreat inward when the outer path has become unbearable. In this sense, even suffering was not meaningless. It was a summons to rediscover what had been abandoned. But the loss of soul is not only individual, it reveals itself on the collective stage. Consider the mood of society today, the polarization of politics, where nuance disappears and each side projects its darkest shadow onto the other. The climate crisis, not only as an environmental catastrophe, but as a psychological one, the dread of a future we feel powerless to change. The epidemic of loneliness, especially among the young, where digital connection replaces genuine community. Each of these is not only a social issue, but a psychological symptom, signs of a civilization drifting from its own center. Even our relationship with work reflects this alienation. The recent phenomenon of quiet quitting is often dismissed as laziness, but perhaps it is something deeper. Perhaps it is the silent refusal to pour one's life into labor that feels empty, mechanical, disconnected from any higher purpose. In Jungian terms, it is the protest of a soul that refuses to be reduced to a cog in a machine. And what of our relentless pursuit of happiness? Advertisements, influencers, entire industries tell us that joy is only one purchase away. Yet, the more we chase it, the further it seems to recede. Jung would say this is because happiness cannot be the goal. To make it the goal is to guarantee disappointment. The deeper need is not happiness, but meaning. And when that need is ignored, we are left restless, perpetually unsatisfied, even in moments of pleasure. This is why the modern epidemic of loneliness is so dangerous. Loneliness today is not just physical isolation, it is existential. You can be surrounded by people, even admired, and still feel utterly unseen. Because to be truly seen requires something society rarely encourages: authenticity. Without it, every interaction risks becoming shallow, transactional, hollow. These are the symptoms of soul loss: anxiety without cause, depression without meaning, anger without outlet, despair without hope. And unless we recognize them for what they are, messages from the neglected depths, we risk medicating them away, distracting them into silence, or projecting them outward onto scapegoats. Jung's warning was clear: what is not faced within will return from without. The unlived life does not simply vanish. It becomes the shadow, haunting dreams, fueling addictions, breaking out in destructive ways when least expected. And so, if we are brave enough, we must read these symptoms not as failures, but as signals. They tell us, you have wandered too far from yourself. The soul has been exiled, and until you turn inward, no external success, no amount of wealth, no digital achievement will quiet its cry. If alienation is the wound of our age, what is the path of healing? Jung never promised easy cures. He distrusted quick solutions. For him, the way back to the soul was not a weekend workshop or a motivational speech. It was a lifelong process, dangerous, demanding, but ultimately transformative. He called this process individuation. At its core, individuation means becoming who you truly are, not who society demands you to be, not who your parents expected you to become, not the polished avatar you present online, but the whole of you, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, integrated into one. How does one begin such a path? Jung suggested several practices, not as techniques in the modern sense, but as ways of listening to the depths of the psyche. Number 1. Imagination. One of Jung's most radical ideas was that the unconscious is not dead matter. It speaks. It communicates in images, symbols, figures. Active imagination is the practice of entering into dialogue with these inner figures, not dismissing them as random, but engaging them as parts of the self. Jung himself practiced this for years, recording his encounters in what became the Red Book. He spoke with visions of prophets, confronted mythic beings, wrestled with his own shadow. For him, these dialogues were not hallucinations, but encounters with the forgotten aspects of the psyche. In our age, where silence is rare and distraction constant, the idea of sitting with one's inner voices may sound unsettling, even frightening. And that is precisely the point. The soul does not return through comfort. It returns through confrontation. Number 2. Dream analysis. Jung insisted that dreams are not meaningless noise. They are the psyche's natural language, the bridge between conscious and unconscious. In a culture obsessed with rational control, Dreams remind us that we are more than logic and schedules. They reveal the forgotten, the repressed, the possibilities we fear to live. Jung often said, "The dream is a door. To ignore it is to lock yourself out of your own house." Think of how many people wake from vivid dreams only to dismiss them, just random. But for Jung, there is no such thing as just random. Every image, a dark forest, a falling tower, a forgotten friend, is a fragment of the soul trying to speak. Number 3. Confronting the shadow. Perhaps Jung's most famous idea, the shadow. Everything we deny, repress, or disown, our anger, envy, fear, lust, cowardice, collects in the shadow. Most people try to bury it, to pretend it doesn't exist. But Jung warned, what you repress does not disappear. It gains power in the dark. It erupts in sudden rage, destructive choices, projections onto others. To integrate the shadow is not to indulge it, but to recognize it as part of yourself. Only then can its energy be transformed into strength, creativity, even wisdom. This is not easy. To face your shadow is to face the parts of yourself you most despise. But Jung believed that wholeness is impossible without this confrontation. Number 4. Symbolic life. Jung emphasized the importance of living with symbols, myths, rituals, stories that give meaning to existence. He argued that modern man suffers because he has lost myth. Religion has declined, but science has not replaced its symbolic power. And so the psyche drifts in a void. To reconnect with myth and symbol, not as superstition, but as living metaphors, is to restore depth to life. This could mean engaging with art, literature, philosophy, or spiritual traditions. Anything that reconnects you to the archetypal dimension of existence. Modern life often tells us that the answers lie outside. Work harder, earn more, upgrade, optimize, perform. But what if the most important task is not outside at all, but inside? Jung insisted that the soul is not an abstract concept. It is the living center of our being, the source of meaning, creativity, and purpose. To neglect it is to live half a life. To reclaim it is to enter a path of transformation, a path that is as old as myth itself. Think of the great stories humanity has told for thousands of years. The hero leaves the safety of the village, ventures into the forest, confronts monsters, finds treasure, and returns transformed. Jung believed that these myths endure because they are not just tales. They are mirrors of the inner journey. The dragon we face is the shadow. The treasure we seek is the self. And the forest we must enter is the unexplored unconscious. This is not a comfortable path. It is not for those who want reassurance. Jung himself endured years of inner descent, chronicled in his Red Book. He confronted visions that terrified him, figures of death, destruction, and despair. And yet he also discovered symbols of renewal, creativity, and meaning that shaped the rest of his life's work. His conclusion was clear. To avoid the journey is to remain incomplete. To undertake it is to risk madness, but also to find wholeness. The modern epidemic of alienation leaves us with a choice. We can continue drifting, endlessly scrolling, endlessly consuming, endlessly comparing, living lives that look full on the surface but feel hollow within. Or we can accept the invitation of the soul, the invitation to turn inward, to confront what we fear, to rediscover what we have forgotten. This is not a call to isolation. Jung did not believe in escaping the world, but in re-entering it transformed. The goal of individuation is not to retreat from society, but to return to it with depth, authenticity, and resilience. To stand in the world not as a mask, but as a self. Imagine for a moment what this could mean. A generation no longer paralyzed by comparison, but rooted in meaning. A society no longer consumed by projection and division, but enriched by individuals who have confronted their own shadows. A culture no longer adrift in distraction, but alive with symbols, myths, and stories that restore depth to existence. The task begins not with grand revolutions, but with the courage of a single individual, with you, to sit in silence, to listen to dreams, to face the shadow you have denied, to ask not, "What do others expect of me?" but what is demanded by the deepest truth within me. This is the adventure Jung invites us to. Not the pursuit of happiness, but the quest for wholeness. Not the escape from suffering, but its transformation into wisdom. Not the worship of the outer image, but the reclamation of the inner soul. The time for this journey is always now, because every day we delay, the mask grows heavier, the soul grows quieter. And yet the moment you turn inward, even in the smallest way, the path begins. The call has always been there. The only question is, will you answer it?